Hey again, I'm going to help you fall asleep with today's true crime story. Please, before we start, comment down below what time it is wherever you are. Let's get to it. What if everything you thought you knew about the perfect marriage was a lie? The chilling unraveling of this real-life case will make you question just how well we truly know the people closest to us. Stick around as we peel back the layers of a love story turned nightmare. At first glance, Sarah and Tom seemed like the kind of couple you only read about in fairy tales. Sarah was a successful marketing executive known for her sharp intellect and friendly demeanor. Her dedication at work earned her the admiration of colleagues, while her involvement in charity groups painted a picture of a person who truly cared about others. Tom, on the other hand, ran a small but thriving construction firm. He was well liked in the community, often described as dependable, charming, and the type of man you'd trust with a handshake deal. Together, they created a life that seemed idyllic. They owned a beautifully kept home in a quiet suburb, attended neighborhood gatherings regularly, and were even known to host elaborate barbecues that brought everyone together. To their friends and family, Tom and Sarah represented stability, success, and a love built on mutual respect. When you looked at the photos they shared on social media, the story of their marriage seemed to match everyone's assumptions. Vacations to sunny beaches, smiling selfies at family get-togethers, and candid moments of them playing with their dog in their backyard were all expertly curated and public for the world to see. There was no sign of arguments, rising tensions, or unhappiness in any of it. Sarah would often caption her posts with words like, "feeling lucky every day," or "so grateful for this beautiful life." Their closest friends saw a couple who laughed at inside jokes, supported each other's ambitions, and moved through life in perfect harmony. Or so it seemed. But as with many things, reality isn't quite as picture-perfect as it looks from the outside. Even in close-knit circles, some began to notice subtle shifts. Sarah had recently been pulling back from social events she used to enjoy. At a neighborhood block party, where she and Tom were regulars, she barely stayed an hour, citing exhaustion from work. Her demeanor seemed slightly quieter and more reserved, as though she were monitoring her every move. While it was easy to dismiss as stress from her demanding job, others quietly wondered why she always seemed to defer to Tom during conversations, letting him answer even casual remarks directed at her. Her sister recalled noticing this pattern more frequently during family dinners, where Sarah would sometimes glance at Tom as if searching for his approval before speaking. Strange as it may have seemed to some, much of Tom's behavior was disarmingly normal. He continued attending community events on his own if Sarah was too tired, often joking that she worked harder than him. When asked about her noticeable absences, Tom would brush it off with charm, saying that they balanced each other out. Her ambition to succeed at work and his knack for taking care of the household seemed like a fitting explanation. "She wears the heels, I wear the tool belt," he allegedly quipped to one neighbor. It wasn't hard to believe that behind the scenes, they were just another busy couple trying to juggle their commitments, even if it meant spending a little less time together. Sarah's family, however, began to see more troubling indicators. While she remained in contact with her parents and siblings, her once lengthy and lively phone calls had grown increasingly brief. She didn't share many details about her relationship anymore, only vague reassurances that everything's fine. Her sister later described her as sounding uneasy, as if she were trying to convince herself of that answer. Sarah's mother pushed her on occasion, asking if there was trouble between her and Tom. Sarah always responded the same way. "It's nothing really. We're just busy." Of course, hindsight often makes it easier to recognize patterns that were easy to overlook in the moment. Friends and co-workers later revealed they had picked up clues as well but failed to connect them. Sarah seemed preoccupied, sometimes distracted during meetings or quick to dismiss casual invitations to after-work drinks. Her boss described her as still performing at a high level professionally, though he acknowledged she seemed a little more tense than usual as of late. The transformation was so subtle over time that even her closest confidants weren't sure when it began. And then came the disappearance. It was a day that started, just like any other, with no apparent warning of what was to come. A Saturday morning, quiet and uneventful, saw Sarah running errands around town. Witnesses recalled seeing her at the local grocery store, exchanging pleasantries with a cashier who knew her by name. She was seen leaving the store with several shopping bags and a wave goodbye. But after that, nothing. No word from Sarah, no sightings, and no evidence of her returning home that day. By evening, when Sarah failed to show up for her scheduled dinner with her parents, her family grew concerned. This wasn't like her. Their calls went unanswered, and messages went unread. Tom, however, appeared calm when reached by Sarah's sister. He insisted that she was likely just caught up with work or decided to visit a friend without letting anyone know. But as hours turned into days, that explanation no longer held weight. The baffling absence left family and friends scrambling to piece together anything that could explain where Sarah had gone or why. Investigators, now alerted to the situation, started piecing together what little information they had. They retraced her steps, reviewed activity on her phone and credit cards, and spoke to those closest to her. The perfect marriage that Sarah and Tom had shown to the world was now the center of an investigation. The cracks in that well-crafted image were beginning to show. Sarah's last known movements on the day she vanished were uneventful on the surface. Security camera footage from the grocery store confirmed she had been there that morning, completing a usual Saturday errand. She was alone, dressed in comfortable clothes, and appeared calm as she exchanged small talk with the cashier. From there, she walked to her car in the parking lot, her hands full of shopping bags. A neighbor also reported seeing her arrive home around lunchtime. The exchange wasn't remarkable. It was just a casual wave as Sarah unpacked her bags and headed inside. That was the last time anyone saw her that day. When Sarah didn't make it to dinner with her parents later that night, her family immediately felt something was wrong. Her parents, Lisa and Mark, tried calling multiple times, but their messages went unanswered. They reached out to Tom, who initially seemed unconcerned. He told them Sarah had probably lost track of time or forgotten about the dinner plans. He assured them she was fine and suggested they wait a little longer before overreacting. But as Sarah's sister pointed out during later interviews, this explanation felt improbable. Sarah wasn't the kind of person to forget commitments, especially when it came to family. By the next morning, when there was still no word from her, Lisa and Mark contacted the authorities to officially report her missing. Police arrived at the couple's home the following day. Tom greeted them at the door, appearing cooperative and composed, even as he answered their initial questions. He explained that they had spent the morning apart, with Sarah running errands while he worked on fixing issues with the house. He mentioned that it wasn't unusual for Sarah to leave the house at short notice, or to need some alone time. Still, he had no explanation for her prolonged silence, and insisted he had no idea where she might be. To the officers, nothing about his demeanor raised immediate suspicions. He was helpful but not overly emotional, consistent but calm. He appeared to be a worried husband trying to make sense of a strange situation. As news of Sarah's disappearance spread, what started as a family's growing alarm soon gripped the entire community. Volunteers assembled swiftly to assist in the search effort, coordinating with local police to cover nearby parks, wooded trails, and surrounding neighborhoods. Flyers with Sarah's face and description were distributed to businesses and tacked onto utility poles. The media took up the story, amplifying its reach with nightly reports urging anyone with information to step forward. The sense of urgency was palpable, but there was no clear direction. There were no signs of a struggle, no odd purchases on her credit cards, and no outgoing calls or texts from Sarah's phone after her last known location. As the days stretched into weeks, the investigation hit frustrating dead ends. The grocery store footage provided no indication of anyone following Sarah after she drove away. Search dogs brought to the home failed to pick up any unusual scents in the surrounding area. The lack of physical evidence puzzled investigators, and even as they worked to reconstruct every detail of Sarah's final day, it felt as though they were chasing shadows. One officer described the initial search as trying to connect dots that simply weren't there. Meanwhile, Tom's public reaction to Sarah's disappearance began to attract attention. He continued cooperating with law enforcement, giving interviews to local news outlets, and joining search efforts alongside volunteers. But to some, his behavior felt oddly detached. In one televised plea for Sarah's return, Tom's tone came off as measured, his words carefully chosen but strangely devoid of emotion. "Sarah, if you can hear this, please come home," he said, his voice steady. He reassured viewers of his belief that she was simply lost or in hiding, though he couldn't explain why. Neighbors and friends began whispering about inconsistencies in his demeanor. One remarked that Tom seemed more focused on managing his routine, continuing renovations on his house, and showing up at the gym, than on the urgency of finding Sarah. Others defended him, insisting that people grieve and process stress differently. Still, as days passed without new leads, public suspicion started to grow, though it remained largely unspoken. Police received dozens of tips from concerned neighbors and strangers who claimed they had seen Sarah in the days after her disappearance. Most were dismissed quickly. Sightings in busy convenience stores or along the highway turned out to be completely unrelated individuals. One tip mentioned a red sedan parked near a wooded area, but the car belonged to an out-of-town hiker who was quickly ruled out. Though frustrating, these red herrings forced investigators to comb through even the smallest threads to ensure nothing was overlooked. The turning point in the case came one evening when officers followed up on a slight inconsistency in Tom's initial statements. During his first interview, Tom mentioned spending the full morning of Sarah's disappearance working on their basement. This matched his neighbor's observation of him unloading supplies earlier that day. But when police reviewed surveillance footage from a nearby intersection, they spotted something that appeared to contradict this story. His truck was seen driving away from the house later that afternoon. When asked for clarification, Tom claimed he had gone to pick up tools from a friend's home but couldn't recall exactly what time. The explanation seemed believable enough, but this small discrepancy prompted police to take a closer look at the missing time in Tom's timeline. With this new focus, a full forensic search of the house, including the basement Tom had been working on, was conducted. While nothing initially appeared out of the ordinary, crime scene technicians noticed areas of freshly poured concrete along one wall. Tom explained that the work had been part of a larger remodel completed a few weeks earlier. However, when officers decided to cut through the new concrete as a precaution, what they found beneath removed all doubt: blood-stained flooring hidden beneath several layers of cement. This discovery shifted the case entirely. Sarah, who had been a missing person just hours earlier, was now presumed dead. The blood matched Sarah's DNA, confirming that foul play had occurred within the couple's home. Detectives described the moment as uncovering the key that made everything else suddenly fall into place. Yet Tom continued to deny involvement, sticking to his claims of innocence. His calm composure remained intact, even as investigators confronted him with the damning evidence. For Sarah's family and the community at large, the shock was almost unbearable. The very idea that violence had erupted behind the closed doors of what seemed like a normal, happy home was difficult to fathom. Search efforts pivoted, with authorities now focusing on recovering Sarah's body. The grief hanging over those who knew her was heavy, amplified by the realization that her disappearance had ended in tragedy, not the hopeful reunion they had been clinging to. The shift in the investigation marked the beginning of a larger reckoning. As detectives continued unraveling the events leading up to Sarah's death, they would uncover more secrets, pieces of a puzzle that painted an even darker picture of what had been hidden beneath the surface of her marriage. For now, suspicions firmly centered on Tom, with every move he made coming under intense scrutiny. What had once been uncertainty had now locked onto something undeniable. This was no accidental disappearance. This, they now believed, was cold-blooded murder. Sometimes, the most dangerous person is the one standing right in front of you. As the search for Sarah shifted from a missing person case to a homicide investigation, attention turned toward the one person who seemed to know her best, her husband, Tom. On the surface, he fit the mold of a heartbroken spouse, desperate for answers. He kept up appearances in interviews, attended community search efforts, and assured police that he would do anything to help bring Sarah home. But behind the scenes, investigators were starting to piece together a different story. It was one in which Tom himself may have been hiding something far more sinister than anyone initially believed. In the first days after Sarah's disappearance, Tom appeared remarkably composed. He cooperated fully, answering every question the police had and providing what seemed like an airtight alibi. According to Tom, he had spent the majority of the day at home, working on a project in the basement. While Sarah had been out running errands, he claimed to have taken advantage of the quiet time to focus on overdue repairs. He explained that he had seen her briefly when she arrived home in the early afternoon, but she left again shortly after, saying she had more to do. After that, he assumed she had gone to her parents' house for dinner as planned. His explanation was logical and straightforward, and it was initially supported by the neighbor who saw him unloading supplies earlier that day. In fact, many people who interacted with Tom during this time found his behavior unremarkable. He did not avoid questions, nor did he lash out when pressed about the details of Sarah's day. Neighbors described him as calm and polite during conversations about her disappearance, often expressing concern for her safety. One even recalled seeing him walk his dog down the street the evening Sarah went missing, casually greeting others as though nothing was amiss. To most, this was the behavior of someone who either had nothing to hide or was exceptionally good at hiding it. The calm exterior, however, began to crack as investigators started to look more closely. While Tom's general demeanor gave little away, inconsistencies began to surface, particularly around his alibi. When officers uncovered footage of his truck leaving the house later in the afternoon, a time he had claimed to be home, questions arose. Tom explained this as a quick errand to retrieve tools from a friend's house, but could not provide an exact address. When officers followed up with the friend in question, it turned out Tom had not been there at all. This was the first of several small but significant discrepancies that painted a picture of someone whose timeline did not quite add up. Further conversations with Sarah's friends and family sharpened this focus. Her sister, who had been skeptical of Tom's initial dismissal of the situation, shared insights that raised even more alarm. She mentioned how quiet Sarah had become in recent months, often deflecting questions about her marriage and avoiding family events. While Sarah never explicitly voiced concerns, her sister described her as not being herself, and added that Sarah's once lively personality seemed muted whenever Tom was around. Other family members echoed similar observations, including instances where Sarah appeared unusually reserved and moments when Tom's presence seemed to overshadow her own. Neighbors also began offering their own recollections as police expanded their interviews. While many thought of Tom as friendly, a few noted subtle behaviors they had not paid much attention to before. One described seeing him sitting in his truck in the driveway for long periods, staring at nothing in particular, which struck them as strange now given the circumstances. Another recalled how Tom often seemed overly concerned with maintaining appearances, from the way he meticulously cared for his lawn to the unwaveringly polite demeanor he displayed in social settings. Looking back, some suspected this might have been an effort to mask something much darker beneath the surface. Investigators increasingly focused on the couple's dynamic behind closed doors. Statements from Sarah's co-workers painted a more complex picture of their marriage than the outwardly perfect one Tom had presented. According to one colleague, Sarah had recently confided in her about feeling overwhelmed, not just by work but by something she vaguely referred to as things at home. While Sarah stopped short of providing details, she hinted at tension in her relationship with Tom and admitted that she sometimes felt she could not do anything right in his eyes. The co-worker described Sarah as hesitant to open up, as though she feared sharing too much might lead to bigger problems. Slowly, these pieces of testimony began to reveal a different side to Tom's personality, one that starkly contrasted with the calm, cooperative figure he presented to law enforcement. Sarah's sister recounted a specific instance from a family barbecue where Tom had snapped at Sarah over what seemed like a minor disagreement. While the moment passed quickly and others brushed it off as typical marital tension, it now stood out as a glimpse of something deeper. It was an undercurrent of frustration or control that was easy to miss in the moment. This pattern of behavior became a critical focus of the investigation as police began piecing together not just a timeline of events but the underlying dynamics that might have led to tragedy. As more time passed, detectives uncovered additional red flags. A financial review of the couple's accounts revealed several unusual transactions made just days before Sarah's disappearance. One of these was a purchase from a home improvement store, where Tom had bought a large quantity of concrete mix. He later attributed this to his ongoing basement project. While this explanation was plausible on its own, it became far more significant when paired with the blood-stained concrete found during the search of their home. This, coupled with Tom's inability to account for the afternoon he was seen driving away, marked a turning point in how investigators viewed him. Still, despite the mounting circumstantial evidence, no formal charges were filed at this stage. Police continued to build their case meticulously, knowing any misstep could compromise potential prosecution. Tom remained under constant scrutiny but outwardly maintained his innocence. In interviews, he repeatedly professed his shock and heartbreak over Sarah's disappearance, sticking to his story that she had simply left the house and never returned. Friends who interacted with him during this period described his behavior as oddly routine and noted how he appeared to carry on with daily activities as though determined not to draw further attention to himself. Behind the scenes, investigators worked tirelessly to connect the dots. Every new discovery, whether it was an inconsistency in Tom's statements, testimony from those who knew Sarah, or forensic evidence collected from their home, brought them closer to unraveling the full truth. It became clear that the cracks in the facade of a happy marriage were just the beginning. Beneath them lay a pattern of troubling behavior that could no longer be ignored. By this point, suspicion had narrowed entirely onto Tom, though he had yet to be taken into custody. For the detectives working the case, the goal was clear: to find the missing pieces that would transform suspicion into certainty. As Tom continued to live under the shadow of their investigation, they prepared for the moment when everything they had uncovered would no longer allow him to hide behind the carefully constructed mask he had worn so well. What secrets were lurking behind the walls of Sarah and Tom's seemingly perfect home? To outsiders, they had always appeared as an ideal couple. But as investigators began peeling back the layers, they uncovered a history of cracks that had been carefully papered over, a relationship riddled with control, manipulation, and hidden conflicts that painted a far darker picture than anyone could have imagined. For years, Sarah had confided bits and pieces to those close to her, though rarely in detail. To her co-workers, she was known as sharp and focused, but also as someone who kept her personal life largely private. Still, certain comments she made in passing hinted at struggles behind closed doors. One co-worker recalled Sarah once mentioning that she felt like she couldn't breathe at home. At the time, it didn't seem significant. "I figured she was just talking about stress," the co-worker later said. She was busy, trying to balance a demanding job and everything else. But in hindsight, these fleeting remarks carried more weight than anyone realized. Family members also described seeing subtle, troubling shifts in Sarah's demeanor over time. Her sister, who had grown concerned about her increasing distance, remembered a conversation from several months before Sarah disappeared. "We were just chatting about life and she got quiet," she recalled. "I asked her if she was happy, and all she said was, 'It's complicated.'" When pressed further, Sarah had brushed it off, explaining that every marriage had its ups and downs. Yet even during family gatherings, those closest to her noticed how she seemed to fade into the background whenever Tom was present. He often dominated conversations, steering topics toward his own achievements, or quickly dismissing anything Sarah might have tried to add. These subtle signs of control were easy to overlook at first, but together they formed a pattern. Multiple friends described scenarios in which Tom appeared to exert influence over Sarah's decisions, often in ways that seemed harmless in the moment. For example, a former college friend recounted how Sarah had mentioned wanting to take a solo vacation but ultimately decided against it after Tom's reaction. She said he didn't like the idea of her traveling alone, the friend shared. "I remember thinking that was odd because Sarah used to love doing things on her own." Police interviews with Sarah's inner circle also revealed another potential source of tension: money. While Sarah had a stable and lucrative career in marketing, Tom's construction business was reportedly more volatile. Public records showed that Tom had experienced financial difficulties in the years leading up to Sarah's disappearance. He had taken out several loans, and, at one point, his business had faced a lawsuit over an incomplete project. Though Tom had managed to stay afloat, Sarah's sister claimed that financial strain had caused friction between the couple. She usually avoided talking about money, but one time she let it slip, her sister explained. She said something like, "I feel like I'm carrying all of this on my own." I could tell it frustrated her. The investigation uncovered further hints that financial stress might have been a driving force in their relationship. Bank statements revealed that Sarah was the primary account holder for most of their savings. More interestingly, in the months before she vanished, she had contacted an attorney to inquire about separating their finances. While there was no direct evidence that she had intended to leave Tom, this step was seen as significant. It suggested that, at the very least, Sarah had been thinking about taking measures to regain some control over her own assets. At the same time, Tom's polished public image began to look less convincing. While most neighbors described him as friendly and easygoing, some recalled moments that hinted at a more short-tempered side. One neighbor, who had lived next door for several years, recalled instances where Tom seemed to lose his composure. "I saw him yelling at workers a few times," she said. "It wasn't just frustration. He had this way of making you feel like you were beneath him." Another neighbor recounted an incident during a community event where Tom berated Sarah for misplacing his phone. "It wasn't loud enough to draw attention from everyone," she clarified. "But you could see her face. She looked embarrassed and just muttered, 'Sorry.'" These subtle but consistent behaviors painted a picture of a man who needed to maintain control, no matter the situation. Friends and family later speculated that this need for control may have extended into his relationship with Sarah, leaving her feeling trapped. "I think she just didn't want to rock the boat," her sister said. "She was such a kind person. She always tried to avoid conflict." As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered evidence suggesting that Tom's darker tendencies weren't limited to their personal life. Records from the couple's shared devices revealed several troubling discoveries. Sarah's phone showed multiple searches for topics like how to leave a marriage safely and signs of emotional abuse. These searches, made in the weeks leading up to her disappearance, hinted at a level of concern Sarah had kept hidden from everyone around her. Investigators also found a series of messages she had sent to a close friend, though they refrained from naming this individual in official statements. In these messages, Sarah described feeling like a shadow of herself and admitted, "I don't know how much more I can take." The investigation reached a critical point when forensic teams completed their analysis of the couple's home. Earlier searches had already uncovered traces of blood beneath the freshly poured concrete in the basement. But now, investigators made a startling discovery hidden within one of the basement's storage areas. A set of Sarah's belongings, including her purse and cell phone, tucked inside a locked toolbox. This find was damning in its implications. If Sarah had truly left the house willingly, why had her personal items been concealed in such an unusual place? The blood evidence, paired with the discovery of her belongings, delivered a devastating blow to Tom's version of events. These clues not only contradicted his claims but suggested that Sarah had never left the home alive. Even more chilling was the realization that Tom had likely gone to great lengths to cover his tracks. Detectives noted that the basement had been meticulously cleaned, with certain areas scrubbed down so thoroughly that it had initially seemed unremarkable during initial walkthroughs. It was only through advanced forensic techniques that they were able to detect the microscopic traces of blood he had tried to erase. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but the weight of these revelations left the community reeling. What had started as a heartbreaking case of a missing woman was now unraveling into a tale of premeditated violence with the most unsettling twist of all. The very person who had publicly played the role of the worried husband was in fact the one authorities believed was responsible. For Sarah's friends and family, the shock was compounded by the slow realization of all the signs they had missed, the moments that seemed inconsequential at the time but now carried haunting significance. As these secrets came to light, Tom's insistence on his innocence grew quieter. He had remained free throughout the investigation, but with each passing day, the evidence against him mounted. Detectives were no longer looking for hints or maybes. They were building an airtight case, and it was becoming clear that Tom's web of lies was finally beginning to unravel. Sometimes, the truth is hidden in plain sight, if you know where to look. For weeks, investigators had been gathering evidence, rechecking timelines, and sifting through everything they could to make sense of Sarah's disappearance. But one crucial piece of evidence had been overlooked, not because it was invisible, but because it seemed ordinary at first. The investigation took a turn when detectives began a second, more detailed forensic analysis of Sarah and Tom's home. Earlier searches had already revealed blood traces beneath the freshly poured concrete in the basement, but one lingering question remained. How had Tom managed to clean the scene so meticulously that initial exams missed key details? The answer, it turned out, was buried not just in the basement floor but in the digital world, an area of evidence they hadn't explored deeply enough until now. During the preliminary investigation, officers had seized both Tom and Sarah's devices, including Sarah's personal laptop. It wasn't until weeks later, when investigators decided to take a closer look at the digital evidence, that they made a breakthrough. On Tom's computer, buried in the browser history, they found a series of incriminating searches, all conducted in the days leading up to Sarah's disappearance. Terms like how to dissolve blood, how long does DNA last, and fastest concrete drying techniques painted a chilling picture of preparation. These searches were time-stamped and matched times when Tom claimed to have been working on harmless home renovations, another crack in his alibi. But the inconsistencies didn't stop there. Investigators compared the internet searches with Tom's credit card records, which revealed purchases that lined up with the searches. 2 days before Sarah went missing, Tom had visited a local hardware store where he bought large quantities of concrete mix, a heavy-duty handsaw, and industrial-grade cleaning supplies. The cashier who served him later recalled that Tom seemed unusually upbeat for someone buying such an odd assortment of items. He joked about tackling a big project, the cashier told police. "I didn't think much of it at the time. People buy weird stuff all the time." The digital evidence didn't just reveal Tom's apparent planning, it also contradicted his story entirely. He had claimed that the concrete work in the basement had been completed weeks before Sarah's disappearance. But receipts, timestamps, and even the materials used told a different tale. Analysis of the concrete layer revealed that it had been poured recently, on the very day Sarah disappeared. Investigators were now certain that the so-called basement project was not a routine home renovation, but an attempt to cover up a crime. Even with these damning clues, detectives were determined to ensure no stone was left unturned. They turned their attention to surveillance footage from areas near the house, looking for anything that might fill in the missing hours of Tom's afternoon. One camera located on a nearby business captured Tom's truck leaving his driveway, a fact he had already admitted. But it was a second piece of footage that changed everything. A private security camera from a residence 2 streets over caught Tom's truck parked alongside a dense wooded area at the edge of town. He was seen unloading what appeared to be a large tarp from the back of his vehicle before walking into the woods. The timestamp showed this occurred just hours after Sarah had been reported missing. Search teams were immediately dispatched to the location caught on camera. With cadaver dogs leading the way, officers combed the dense undergrowth for several hours. Eventually, they came across the remains of a shallow grave covered in leaves and brush. Inside, they found Sarah's body, wrapped in the same tarp seen on the surveillance footage. The decomposing remains showed signs of blunt force trauma to the head, and later autopsy reports confirmed this as the cause of death. The grave site also yielded more physical evidence, including traces of soil and debris that matched materials found on Tom's boots during an earlier search. The discovery of Sarah's body was the final piece investigators needed to solidify their case, though it didn't come without its emotional toll. For her family, friends, and the community, the confirmation of her death was devastating. The sense of hope they had clung to was replaced by grief and anger, knowing that her life had been taken in such a brutal and deliberate way. For law enforcement, the breakthrough was bittersweet. One detective described the feeling as a mix of relief and sadness, explaining that they finally had the answers, but still wished the outcome had been different. As the evidence continued to mount, Tom's behavior began to shift. In the days following the discovery of Sarah's body, he grew noticeably more reserved. Friends who had defended him started to notice cracks in his once confident demeanor. He wasn't acting like himself, a neighbor later recalled. Before, he'd always make eye contact, hold a conversation, but after they found Sarah, he wouldn't even look you in the eye. Police remained cautious, knowing they needed to ensure every piece of their case was airtight before making an arrest. They meticulously mapped out the evidence: the blood in the basement, the digital searches, the hardware store purchases, and now the surveillance footage and the gravesite itself. With each piece, the narrative became clearer. This was not a case of accident or misunderstanding. It was premeditated murder, carefully planned and poorly disguised. The decisive moment came when investigators confronted Tom with the complete timeline they had reconstructed. During questioning, they laid out the evidence in detail, including the digital footprints, the forensic matches, and the surveillance footage. Tom, who had maintained his innocence up until this point, reportedly froze. His confident exterior cracked for the first time. According to one officer, you could see it in his face. He knew there was no way out. Despite this, Tom refused to confess, instead opting to repeatedly state, "I didn't do anything wrong," even as detectives dismantled his defense piece by piece. Finally, on a quiet Wednesday morning, officers made the arrest. Tom was taken into custody at his home without incident, though the scene outside was anything but calm. Reporters and onlookers crowded the area as news of his arrest spread. The community's shock was palpable, not because he had been arrested, but because the man who had once woven the story of a perfect marriage had now been exposed as a murderer hiding in plain sight. Tom's trial would later become a national sensation, but in that moment, the community was left wrestling with the truth. How could someone so familiar, so seemingly ordinary, have committed such an extraordinary crime? For Sarah's loved ones, the arrest brought a small sense of closure, though the pain of her loss lingered. The case had finally reached a turning point, but the question of why Tom had done it, what had truly driven him to such extremes, remained unanswered. And for many, that was the most unsettling truth of all. The courtroom was packed. Journalists crammed into the rows meant for the public, their notebooks and cameras ready, while Sarah's family sat quietly in the front, holding on to one another for support. The trial of Tom, now officially charged with the murder of his wife, had gained national attention. The media, always eager for stories of betrayal and mystery, had turned this case into a spectacle. Reporters dissected every detail, from Tom's stoic face during his arrest to footage of Sarah smiling in better days. To the public, this trial wasn't just about guilt or innocence, it was a window into how a marriage that looked perfect could hide something so dark. As the trial began, the prosecution laid out the facts meticulously. Their focus was on painting a clear picture of Tom's actions leading up to and following Sarah's disappearance. Day by day, the evidence was presented in chronological order: the suspicious internet searches, the concrete purchases, the blood traces in the basement, and, most damning of all, the surveillance footage showing his truck near the wooded area where Sarah's body was later discovered. The prosecutor addressed the jury directly, describing Tom's behavior as a calculated effort to erase Sarah from his life and hide the truth. "This was not a spur of the moment act," she said. "It was planned, deliberate, and cold." The defense, however, fought to break through this narrative. Their strategy centered on raising doubts about the evidence, suggesting that much of it was circumstantial and could be interpreted in different ways. Tom's lawyer argued that the blood in the basement could have been the result of a minor injury Sarah had sustained months before. They pointed to the lack of direct eyewitnesses and highlighted gaps in the timeline that they claimed could not definitively place Tom at the scene of her death. Throughout the trial, the defense repeated one core message: there is no conclusive proof that Tom killed Sarah. One of the defense's boldest moves was to question the reliability of the surveillance footage. The grainy quality of the second video showing Tom's truck near the wooded area became a point of contention. The defense raised concerns about the timestamp accuracy, even suggesting that the truck in the footage might not have been Tom's at all, since the license plate was not visible. They leaned heavily on the argument of reasonable doubt, urging the jury to avoid making decisions based on assumptions. If the defense focused on technicalities and ambiguities, the prosecution leaned on emotional and tangible proof. In a pivotal moment, Sarah's co-worker, the same one who had noticed her growing unease in the months before her disappearance, took the stand. She described Sarah as so vibrant and full of life, but revealed how that spark had faded over time. She stopped being herself, the co-worker testified, her voice breaking. She seemed scared, like something was weighing on her constantly, and she didn't know how to get out from under it. Even more heartbreaking was the testimony of Sarah's sister, who recounted the last time she spoke to her. The courtroom grew silent as she remembered Sarah's cryptic remark about her marriage being complicated. Looking directly at the jury, she said, "If I'd known what was really happening, I would have done something. I would have helped her get out." Her words served as a somber reminder of the warning signs that had gone unnoticed by those closest to Sarah. The prosecution also brought in forensic experts, who detailed the lengths to which Tom had gone to hide his crime. One expert explained how blood spatter patterns on the basement floor indicated a violent attack, contradicting the defense's claim of an old injury. Another specialist testified about the recently poured concrete, pointing out how the mixture's composition matched the type Tom had purchased at the hardware store a day before Sarah vanished. These testimonies painted a picture that was hard to refute. A man who spent weeks planning a crime scene he thought he could erase. The trial wasn't without its dramatic moments. At one point, the defense called Tom himself to testify. It was a risky move. On the stand, he maintained his innocence, claiming that he and Sarah had a perfectly normal marriage with its occasional ups and downs. He denied any involvement in her death and insisted the blood found in the basement was unrelated to her disappearance. "I loved my wife," he said firmly, locking eyes with the jury. "I would never hurt her." Despite his confident tone, there were moments during cross-examination when his composure faltered. When asked directly why he thought Sarah's belongings had been hidden in the toolbox, his response was awkward and unconvincing. Honestly don't know," he stammered. "Maybe she put them there herself. I can't say." The jury's reaction to his testimony was difficult to gauge, but his performance didn't seem to sway public opinion in his favor. Throughout the trial, moments arose that left spectators wondering if the defense's strategy might find traction. For instance, the grainy security footage raised enough doubts for the defense to suggest alternative possibilities. They even floated the idea that someone else could have planted the evidence in the basement, though they failed to provide any plausible suspects. At times, it felt as though they were grasping at straws, but the idea of reasonable doubt hung heavy in the ira, reality the prosecution worked tirelessly to counter. As the trial stretched into its closing weeks, the weight of Sarah's family's loss became a recurring theme. The prosecution showed footage from the early days of the case, Sarah's parents pleading for answers, neighbors searching tirelessly through wooded areas, and, finally, the police press conference, where her death was confirmed. The jury watched intently, their faces a mix of solemnity and discomfort. A closing argument from the prosecution reminded them of the human cost of this crime. "This isn't just about evidence," the prosecutor said. "This is about the life that was taken, the people who loved her, and ensuring that justice is served for Sarah." When the case was handed to the jury, the mood in the courtroom was tense. Deliberations lasted for 3 full days, each passing hour intensifying the anticipation. The gallery buzzed with speculation. Some believed the defense had succeeded in planting just enough doubt to sway a juror or two. Others were convinced the mountain of evidence against Tom was too overwhelming for any other outcome than a guilty verdict. Finally, the jury returned. Everyone in the room, from Sarah's family to the reporters hurriedly jotting down notes, sat on the edge of their seats. The courtroom fell silent as the four persons stood to deliver the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Thomas Keller, guilty of first-degree murder. Gasps rippled through the gallery, followed by quiet sobs from Sarah's family. Tom sat motionless, his face betraying no visible reaction. His lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, but Tom didn't acknowledge it. The sentencing occurred weeks later, with the judge condemning Tom to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In their closing remarks, the judge said this was a senseless, premeditated act carried out with shocking disregard for human life. The evidence does not lie. For Sarah's family, though the verdict brought them some measure of justice, it couldn't erase the pain of losing her. Outside the courthouse, Sarah's mother addressed the media, saying, "We still can't make sense of why this happened, but we can take comfort in knowing Sarah's voice was heard." The trial had captivated the nation, but for those who knew Sarah, the story was far from entertainment. It was a stark reminder of the fragile line that separates the surface from what hides beneath her, truth that will linger long after the cameras have gone. The trial's conclusion marked the end of a long, grueling legal battle, but for Sarah's family and the community around them, it was only the beginning of the aftermath. The guilty verdict brought an undeniable sense of relief. Justice had been served. Yet, this wasn't the kind of closure that erased pain. It couldn't bring Sarah back or fill the void she left behind. For many, the case became a defining moment, reshaping how they viewed relationships, trust, and the hidden dangers that can exist in plain sight. In the days following Tom's sentencing, community members gathered to hold a vigil in Sarah's honor. Hundreds of residents, from neighbors to former classmates, stood together, holding candles as they remembered the woman who had once seemed so full of life. Her parents, Lisa and Mark, spoke briefly to the crowd, sharing heartfelt words about their daughter. Mark said, "Sarah had a warmth about her that made everyone feel special. She deserved so much more than what she went through." His voice cracked as he spoke, the grief still raw, but his gratitude for the community's support was clear. For Sarah's family, the vigil was a way to focus on her life rather than the circumstances of her death. The conviction brought some sense of accountability, but questions still lingered. Many in the community, and even among Sarah's inner circle, struggled with the same haunting thought. Were there signs they should have seen? Could someone have stepped in earlier to prevent the tragedy? Her close friends recounted moments where Sarah vaguely hinted at problems in her marriage, but never openly asked for help. "You think you know someone's life from the outside," one friend said later. "But now I wonder if I missed all the times she was trying to tell us something without actually saying it outright." These unanswered questions spurred conversations about the hidden nature of abuse, how it often exists behind closed doors, shielded by silence and fear. Advocacy groups in the area took up Sarah's story as a rallying cry, organizing events to spread awareness about domestic violence and emotional abuse. Flyers started appearing at local businesses and community centers with resources for survivors, bearing a simple but powerful tagline, "You're not alone. Speak up." A local hotline that offered support for abuse victims reported a noticeable increase in calls during the weeks after the trial, a sign that Sarah's case had inspired others to seek help. Sarah's death did more than just spark community conversations. It also led to tangible changes. Lawmakers in the state pushed for reforms aimed at expanding protections for victims of domestic violence and making it easier to detect patterns of abuse before they escalate. One proposed law, nicknamed Sarah's Law by supporters, focused on creating better access to restraining orders and increasing funding for local shelters. Though the bill was still in its early stages, it had already gained traction, with numerous community members advocating for its passage during public hearings. While Sarah's case didn't directly involve law enforcement failings, it did prompt an internal review of how local authorities handle missing person investigations. Police officials admitted that while they'd acted quickly in this instance, there was room for improvement, particularly in how they communicate with families during the early stages of an investigation. Chief of Police Alan Porter told reporters, "When someone goes missing, every second counts." This case reminded us how critical it is to act decisively, but also with compassion for those who are suffering. He emphasized plans to enhance officer training, focusing on identifying potential red flags in interviews and handling emotional family members more effectively. As the weeks passed, more stories emerged that added depth to Sarah's legacy. Former co-workers spoke of her dedication at work, describing her as a natural leader who genuinely cared about her team. A colleague said, Sarah wasn't just about doing her job well. She wanted everyone around her to feel valued. She had this way of making the workplace feel a little brighter. Another acquaintance shared how Sarah volunteered regularly at a non-profit that provided school supplies to underprivileged children. She didn't do it for recognition, they explained. She just genuinely wanted to help. For Sarah's family, preserving her memory became a driving force. Her sister, Melissa, began working with a local support organization to start a scholarship fund in Sarah's name. The fund aimed to help young women pursue careers in fields that Sarah had been passionate about, such as marketing and community outreach. Melissa explained, Sarah believed in empowering others, especially women. This is our way of ensuring she keeps making a difference, even though she's not physically here with us anymore. One of the most poignant reflections came from an investigator who worked the case from the beginning. Detective Martha Hill, who had attended Sarah's vigil, later admitted in an interview that it was one of the most emotionally challenging cases of her career. You don't forget cases like this, she said. It's the kind of thing that stays with you not just because of what happened, but because of who it happened to. Sarah was someone you could have known in your own life, a sister, a friend, a neighbor. Hill went on to emphasize the importance of vigilance, not just within law enforcement but for everyone. If someone seems off, if you notice changes in their behavior, don't ignore it. That small conversation could be the difference between life and death. Despite all these efforts to honor Sarah's life and learn from her death, there were still lingering emotions that couldn't be neatly resolved. For many, the most unsettling aspect of the case was how easily Tom had concealed his darker side. To this day, neighbors and friends wrestle with the fact that he seemed so ordinary that someone capable of such harm walked among them unnoticed for so long. It's terrifying, one neighbor reflected. You think you know people, but you don't always see what's really going on when the doors are closed. This sentiment echoed far beyond the community, resonating with anyone who followed the case. Through the pain and loss, Sarah's story became a call to action. Her life and tragic death served as a reminder that even in the seemingly safest spaces, vigilance matters. Friends, family, and communities have a role in looking out for one another, in listening to the signs that might otherwise go unheard. It also underscored the courage it takes for victims to speak up, and the responsibility society has to make sure they're heard. Sarah's family continues to grieve, but they also take solace in small victories: the scholarship fund, the increased public awareness, the potential legislative changes all born from Sarah's untimely death. In a statement issued by the family several months after the trial, they wrote, Sarah was a light in this world. She gave so much of herself to others, and she deserved better than what happened to her. While nothing will ever fill the void she left, we hope her story inspires others to recognize the signs of abuse and take action. As the community moves forward, Sarah's legacy remains ever present, a symbol of hope, a cautionary tale, and a reminder of how important it is to look beyond the surface. The impact of her loss will never fully fade, but neither will the lessons her story left behind. Justice was delivered in the courtroom, but its cost remains immeasurable. For Sarah's family, no sentence could ever bring her back or repair the quiet devastation left behind. Her story forces us to reevaluate the people closest to us and whether the masks they wear hide something far darker. Relationships can disguise danger, and the signs of control or harm are often ignored until it's too late. Let Sarah's memory remind us to listen, to question, and to act when something feels wrong. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes vigilance can make all the difference. We'll see you next time.